reserving some time at the end for your questions. Also, if you were interested in tweeting about the event, please use the hashtag available and tag us at UMD_CRI. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Rashawn Ray, who is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, a professor of sociology, executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, and the leader of BSOS's Anti-Black Racism Initiative at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Ray is also a former faculty director of CRI. He will be giving some brief remarks on continued efforts to reckon with the aftermath of the murder of First Lieutenant Richard Collins' death on our campus, and to address anti-Black racism more broadly. Please welcome Dr. Ray.
Dr. Dow, thank you for having me. Kudos to you, the Critical Race Initiative. I just continue to be excited about being able to be a part of this work, particularly in a moment in time where we are right now, where there are literal attacks on critical race theory directly coming out of the White House. And I think events like this continue to highlight the importance of the work that scholars are doing. I also want to give a special thank you to Chandra Reyna and Sydney Yarborough for the work that they continue to do as graduate assistants with the Critical Race Initiative. What I want to talk about is the legacy of First Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III, who was killed in a hate crime on the University of Maryland campus in College Park. Since that particular event, the University of Maryland, as well as Bowie State and others, have came together to aim to form a circle around the Collins family, including working with the First Lieutenant Collins Foundation. There have been a series of very important steps that lead University of Maryland to be a leader in this space. The first thing that happened recently is that there is a Collins Alliance, a Justice Alliance, that is merging University of Maryland and Bowie State. We've been meeting for months. We have events planned. We have various opportunities to collaborate, to bring together students across Prince George's County to highlight this important work. The second thing is that there was a hate crime bill passed at the state level in Maryland. This is a very, very important piece of legislation. Including myself, there were also representatives from the Critical Race Initiative who were in attendance and who testified at that particular hearing, including Paige Miller. One of the things that's interesting about that legislation that's extremely important is that previous legislation for hate crimes have read that a person needed to engage in an act completely because of race or sexism or Islamophobia and the like. But this legislation changes it, because one thing we know about people's attitudes and behaviors, they're oftentimes using various reasons to make a decision. So now the key part of the legislation reads, in part due to these protected clauses, people would engage in certain types of activities. This is a very, very important piece of legislation for aiming to deal with hate crimes, to help create equity and justice in our country, and to also deal with the legacy and current remnants of white supremacy and white nationalism. So we continue to forge in the work that we're doing here as it relates to supporting the First Lieutenant Collins III Foundation, and also supporting Mr. and Mrs. Don and Rick Collins. With that being said, it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Gregory Ball, who is the Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences here at the University of Maryland. Dean Ball has continued to be extremely supportive of the Critical Race Initiative, and then also helping to form the Anti-Black Racism Initiative that is in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. I continue to be pleased to be in a place that considers these particular topics to be of importance to the legacy that we're doing. And I'm super excited about this panel today. The people who are on the panel are some of my favorite scholars, and people are definitely in for a treat. So Dean Ball, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Professor Ray. Much appreciated. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. Our college is proud to support the Parent J. Mitchell Symposium and its mission in advancing the legacy of the late Congressman. This annual symposium continues the work of Congressman Mitchell by bringing together scholars, activists, and public officials to discuss issues of vital social concern. Today's panel speaks to Congressman Mitchell's push to address the root causes of racial inequality among Black and Latinx people and other communities of color. This session explores how people from various racialized backgrounds experience criminalization in their daily lives. Criminalization happens to children of color in schools, while shopping at stores, playing at the park, are simply walking down the street. These issues have been exacerbated during the pandemic, and attention has been further drawn to them by recent protests produced by ongoing anti-Black racism. Today, our panelists will discuss various manifestations of criminalization and how they differentially affect particular racialized groups in society. I want to thank Associate Professor of Sociology, Dr. Dawn Dow, and PhD students Chanda Reyna, Sydney Yarborough, Simone Durham, and Robin Moore for their excellent work organizing this symposium. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for taking this time to join us for this first panel of the Perrin J. Mitchell Symposium Series. I would now like to introduce Dr. Amelia Brannigan, an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park, who will be serving as the moderator for this panel. Dr. Brannigan.
Thanks, Dr. Wall. I will begin by introducing our three panelists. We have Otis Johnson, who is Professor of Education and Sociology, as well as Director of the Institute in Critical Quantitative, Computational, and Mixed Methodologies, and Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity at Washington University in St. Louis. We then have, there we go. We have Dr. Yasser Payne, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at the University of Delaware. Thanks to you both for joining us. And finally, we have Dr. Bahia Mohammed, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Howard University. Thank you all for joining us. I will proceed to our first question, which is, how does criminalization and racialization play out in your scholarship? Dr. Johnson, we'll start with you. We'll proceed in the order of the introduction. So we will do Dr. Payne next, and Dr. Mohammed, you will be third.
Dr. Brannigan, it's wonderful to meet you, and I want to thank the departments of sociology and also the Dean's Office for inviting me to participate on the panel. This is a really important topic, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation and what the other panelists have to say on the topic. At Washington University in St. Louis, I'm the PI of the Fatal Interactions with Police study, which is the nation's first probability study of police homicides and race, and also neighborhoods. I'm also a PI of 4 NSF grants right now that are looking at the impact of social control within schools on racial differences in STEM. And one of the key questions there is, will draining that school to prison pipeline help fill the STEM pipeline? So we're really interested in the interconnection between those two opportunity structures within schools. And then lastly, as Dr. Brannigan mentioned, I'm the director of the Institute in Critical Quantitative, Computational, Mixed Methodologies, which is an institute that was awarded by the National Science Foundation and then supported with additional awards from the William T. Grant Foundation and the Spencer Foundation. And the Institute is not only designed to equip scholars of color with the skills necessary to compete successfully for awards, grant awards, and to further their research, and also the integration of quantitative and computational methodologies within mixed methods. It also is within a critical framework and a broadening participation perspective, which recognizes that equipping research and researchers in the broader public with a critical awareness of how these methodologies and approaches to research have structured inequality and opportunity. And by the way, processes of racialization, supremacy, and erasure is essential to understanding the social implications of data science within an increasingly diverse world. So we're hoping that the Institute will create not only a conversation about the importance, the social implications of data science, but also to diversify the ranks of those using those methods.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. We'll continue, Dr. Payne, just to repeat the question. It is, how does criminalization and racialization play out in your scholarship?
Cool. Well, just to quickly introduce myself, again, my name is Dr. Yasser Payne. I'm on faculty in the Department of Africana Studies and Sociology and Criminal Justice. A lot of my work actually focuses on a methodological framework in which we created entitled Street Participatory Action Research. So right now we have 3 studies in Wilmington. We work closely with Christiana Care Hospital, which is like the dominant hospital system in Delaware, or the John Hopkins, if you will. Right. We also have a national study, a national pilot study in 4 other cities, right? Baltimore, which will be coming too soon, New Orleans, Detroit, and also Brooklyn. And really quickly, street PAR is when you include members, particularly of street identified populations, on the research team, and you include them in every phase of the research project, be it development of theory, methods, analysis, co-authorship, publications, right? And they should be paid for their experiences. In addition to a research experience, it's also an activist-oriented experience, right? And it has to be like real activism. So research plus activism, right, equals PAR, and we do a street PAR iteration. Another way of thinking about it, right, as I often say in my speeches or with the guys and the women, right, we're bringing the doctoral student model to the street corner. This is the way that we help, right? By arming them with a reading, writing, data analysis, and activist skill set, right? That would allow them to evolve out of their circumstances into upward mobility while holding on to their identity in authentic ways, right? That is the purpose of Street PAR. And we've had really great success. A number of projects have sprung up around the country in which we consult on. And our goal, our dream is to do a project, right? One national project from Harlem to LA, from Chi-Town down to Houston. With that said, and to answer the question more directly, for me, right, and let me take the second part of the question, racialization, and then finish up with criminalization, and I promise you I will be quick. And I do want to preface my thoughts by saying I'm probably going to be a little provocative, you know, all in the name of, all in the spirit of justice and liberation, right? I'm not here to rock the boat too much, but at the heart of this panel, you know, is critical race theory. So we are going to definitely, you know, we're definitely going to speak to critical race theory in real ways. For me, race and ethnicity, right, are extremely important or integral factors to my analysis on street identified Black American populations. In fact, nothing explains, I think, better the attitudinal, the behavioral, the social and or structural outcomes more than racial ethnic designations. In fact, right, for me, race in and of itself as a kind of pan-oriented, as a pan group, if you will, it covers over, it hides, it conceals a lot of what's actually going on in the country. Racial ethnic designation explains it better. So, right, I'm most interested, excuse me, in street identified Black American populations, particularly descendant of the slave South, right? And I think to get at and to respond to your question or the part of the question on criminalization, right? I think it's important, ironically enough, through policy and our research, and that's including white, liberal, and Black scholarship, to criminalize poor Black American populations. And in this case, and especially the men, to rationalize or justify the necessary criminalization of them. So why is it necessary? Right? And critical race theory, particularly Derek Bell, right, the founder, but his particular iteration of it, right? We are a bottom caste. That is our purpose in this country, right? And our bottom casteness, and by that again, I mean Black Americans descendant of the slave South, our bottom casteness is necessary to prop up the economy. Let's put it another way. There is no wealth, there is no privilege, right? Our nice university positions, and I value mine as well, right? There are no good Christmases, right? There's no good birthday parties or happy hours without millions of Black Americans and other poor populations as well, living in extreme structural violence. You cannot have one without the other. So for me, the criminalization, right, of these populations and our role in it, right, helps to justify it, just helps to justify it, their criminalization, and or undergird the overall economic structure.
Thanks, Dr. Payne. That was an interesting and provocative answer, and very much the sort of gets to the heart of what we're hoping to be talking about today. So we're gonna send the same question, Dr. Mohammed. Again, how does criminalization and racialization play out in your scholarship?
Thank you so much for hosting this panel. I'm very honored to be on this panel with such an esteemed group of experts and scholars. My work specifically around racialization and criminalization rests itself in my research expertise and experience on children of incarcerated parents. And so a lot of what I come into this work with is looking at the criminalization of Black children as a direct impact of their connections to their incarcerated parents that they love tremendously, their family members and different individuals. And so really looking at a stigmatized population that individuals are shepherding in on the school to prison pipeline as a direct result of the strength and resiliency among their criminal parents. And so just the duality of trying to fight through rhetoric as well as methodology and applied sociology, this understanding that as an incarcerated Black mother, Black father, Latinx brother or father, or even indigenous, that you are less than, that you are not able to be a parent. A lot of my work starts from a place of resilience because I don't believe in romanticizing these deficit-based perspectives, right? Where a lot of the research looks at the population of others and think of them in a way as less than and not capable, when in fact, if the descendants of enslaved individuals are able to survive, mass incarceration is definitely something strategically that is in the genes of melanated individuals to be able to be set up to survive. I feel that the rhetoric is debilitating and keeping individuals from being able to talk about these issues realistically. For example, in a recent national study that I conducted on children of incarcerated parents, we identified that incarcerated fathers were seen as mentors, that they were able to not only parent from prison, but help daughters maintain positive relationships, build self-efficacy, build self-esteem, and just build love in themselves. So this concept of othering Black fathers as a result of white supremacy through the criminal injustice system is ludicrous. This lends itself also to my work in the classroom, which I use as a radical platform to be able to give students opportunities to face reality. For example, all of the classes that I teach are in carceral spaces where half of the individuals are incarcerated and the other half matriculated at the university. And oftentimes when these models are taught at predominantly white institutions, it's all about a conversation. But for me, it is about facing reality. There is no sociological or criminological or racialization of concepts that I could teach anyone that is lying to themselves about their reality, ashamed of the family members that they have in their own locus that are incarcerated. And so for the first part, I get students to get intimate and close with mass incarceration as a means to understanding that they should not be ashamed of anything. In fact, that the criminal injustice system is working directly as it was created to work, and therefore they must learn to understand it and become intimate with it in order to begin to even dismantle it. So a lot of my classes bring individuals out of their comfort zone and into these carceral spaces to engage in realistic curriculums, what I call life curriculum. So oftentimes assignments will require incarcerated parents to write a letter to their children explaining incarceration. They can incorporate any of the readings that they have in the classroom, which means they're allowed to bring in critical race theory. They're allowed to talk about white supremacy. They're allowed to talk about the reality of the system and the way that it works. So at the same time that I'm working to build bonds between Black families and brown families, we are also educating the next generation so that they have the social capital to fight with their mouths in the same ways that they can with their feet and with their hands. My work really beds itself in the same fashion with law enforcement. And so this semester, as well as over the last 5 years, I've been teaching a course that I created called Policing Inside Out. It brings together Black millennials, oftentimes that have a hatred and distrust for law enforcement, into a same classroom with white law enforcement officials. And we engage in conversations across a 15-week curriculum. It requires students and officers to do excursions where they go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which we see through the Metropolitan Police Department. We find that there's a policy now in place where all officers are required to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture to gain a better understanding of the history of African Americans. And so that came out of the Policing Inside Out course, which now we're seeing expanding across the nation, where I felt that it just makes more sense to go to the African American History and Culture Museum along with minority students as a way to really engage in critical consciousness. My belief is that training between law enforcement officers before they are badged with a gun, they should be in these communities engaging with Black intellectuals, not just intellectuals that look like those individuals that they are trained to arrest, incarcerate, and destroy, but also those individuals that are esteemed scholars on HBCU campuses. And so throughout the course of the span of the semester, they do ride-alongs during the morning, during the night. We have very engaged conversations on use of force, 13th Amendment, Second Amendment, First Amendment, and all of these sort of things to figure out, are there ways that we can engage in conversations? What are those conversations? But more importantly, to empower the Black and brown students that find themselves matriculating at Howard University to understand that every fight is not the fight that should be the end of your life, and to be reminded that the next generation is the generation that we have to teach to be able to overcome. And so really it allows for students to grapple with their emotions, with their ideas, and with their concepts so that they can critically analyze the race perspectives in white supremacy frameworks around the original foundation of policing in the world.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for a very powerful answer, and for an answer that helps transition us additionally into our next question, which is on early childhood and young adulthood. So the next question, again, will go back to Dr. Johnson, and it will be, what are some of the challenges you see regarding criminalization for the populations you study from early childhood to young adulthood?
Wow, it's a great question too. So with the social control in schools study, the lab has been looking at nationally representative data, really data from the National Center of Education Statistics, to understand nationwide, what are the odds that someone of color will end up snatched within the school to prison pipeline, and what are those trajectories like for them? In other words, how are their performances, especially within STEM programs, and then are they likely to go to college, and are they likely to enter the workforce? So we're actually looking at 10 years of data for use, repeated measures, and able to estimate some pretty durable odds of incarceration and other life outcomes. And so we found a number of things that I think are really important. One, we found that kids are likely, Black kids in particular, are more likely to be in schools that we call high social control schools, meaning that these schools put in place excessive suspension policies, expulsion policies, have stricter dress codes. They have random book bag searches, random dog sniffing for contraband or some type of drugs. And we find that the consequences are pretty steep, not only for those that are identified for discipline or punishment, but we find on average, we call this a spillover effect, that within high social control schools, the average math scores go down for all students, not just those who are directly participating or snatched within this school to prison pipeline. So that, I think, is really this opportunity for what we call interest convergence, where it's clear the cost of this policy course is being shared by more than just African Americans. Also, we're interested in how schools have been transformed lately within what we call its social purpose. So someone like Althusser would say that schools were our primary ideological state apparatus. And really, it has transformed over time to what he might call the RSA, which is a repressive state apparatus, a designation that he used to identify police, courts, military. And the reason why we're concerned about this is because we're seeing now the odds of incarceration are not higher for uh, kids that are accosted or engaged by police outside of schools. In other words, and this is a great statistic for this, in San Bernardino from 2005 to 2014, they arrested about 7,000 kids within neighborhoods, but they arrested over 30,000 within their schools. So schools are now becoming the first, really for the majority of those who end up, in jail later, the first point of contact with law enforcement. And so we should be really concerned about the social transformation of schools in that way. And then lastly, I'll just say with the moving on into young adulthood, the fatal interactions with police study has, generated some pretty sobering data. And one, I want to say that, and this is kind of getting back to something that Yasser mentioned, and I think is something that needs to be said, that while Black men are perhaps the most criminalized, the misidentification is perhaps most acute for Black women, because our data show that women, Black women in particular, who have been killed by police, 60% of them were killed while unarmed. So there's something acute happening for Black women that is not happening for any other race gender slice. And so then getting back to the young adult lessons learned or findings from the fatal interactions with police study, while this has been an African-American, other binary often within the media, we're actually finding that Hispanic youth, Hispanic youth have the highest odds of a police fatality. And again, for racial groups, overall, it would be African Americans, probably followed by indigenous populations. But for young people, there is something happening there that I think social science needs to interrogate more closely, and also media needs to catch up, because there is something happening within those communities as well. This is far beyond just a Black-white binary.
Cool. I'll jump in. Also just want to preface the comments by, because I do have some targeted thoughts around this. But my work is, multi-method, very intergenerational, right? We're looking at, cross-sectional work though, but cross-sectional data, but we're looking at large survey samples, sometimes ranging between ages 16 to 54, right? And this is squarely on street identified Black American populations, quota samples, the whole kit and caboodle, right? I think, and at the risk of sounding arrogant, I think we're the only research program in the country that can collect large community samples on the ground, right? And I'm talking about hundreds, thousands of surveys, in a very rigorous manner, particularly in hot sites, right? Places where they sell crack cocaine or heroin, right? Right, and so we're able to really compare and look at men and women and boys and girls across age, particularly in a single racial ethnic group, which I think is pretty amazing, right? And these guys and women are the magic, right? Not me, right? And we learn a lot of things, particularly when we look at our policing data. We learn a number of things, right? And I think most surprising for us is a lot of their experiences, particularly with police, interestingly enough, their attitudes and some of their experiences with police are not necessarily the same. In my work, they're not coming in contact with police, obviously, at the same rate, even for women in the streets, right? And we're able to measure that. right, in active populations. I think it's also important to underscore, right, that we have more Black men in prison than all women around the world. I'm gonna say that one more time. We have more Black men in prison, right, than we have all women combined in the world. They're not having the same experience with police overall. And that's not definitely a shot that's against anyone on this panel, or definitely against women. That's not what our work is about. Our work is about racial and cultural solidarity. And I think we need to honor different experiences. I do think crime and who we arrest and incarcerate, that's more cultural, right? So the fact that we arrest, that white folk aren't arrested at the same rate has more to do with cultural decisions than anything. The fact that Black men and women are having very different experiences as it relates to police, I would say is more cultural, right? The men are being targeted in particular kinds of ways. In Delaware, right, we probably have a small state, we probably have roughly 7,000 folk that are actually incarcerated, right? Those are mostly Black men, for what it's worth. Women in the state of Delaware on any given year or hover around 400 people. Yep, you heard me, 400 people. And most of those women are actually not doing prison time. Those are pretrial detainees and or folk who are doing jail time, right? Less than a year. So we're looking at roughly 50 to 100 women, we estimate, they don't provide the data, that are actually locked up doing prison time. Again, not to dismiss or undermine the women's experiences, because they need to be honored as well. And both men and women, boys and girls, are on my team. We look at both of those populations across age cohorts, right? And as a way to understand the experiences together. More specifically, and to answer the question, for me, what's most challenging is grappling with how intentional the criminalization of Black men and women in the streets are, right? That's intentional, that's necessary, right? So that you and me can enjoy our privilege. You cannot have one without the other. The intentionality of what we are describing as the structural violence complex is necessary. Particular racial ethnic populations are targeted to maintain the status quo. There is no way to address our problems without addressing the extreme poverty. 50 to 60%, right? Particularly when you look at racial wealth gap data, which is blazing, all right, in the literature right now. 50 to 60%, right, of Black Americans have $0 in wealth. I wish I was making that up. Nobody's losing any sleep, neither. And that's including Black folk. By 2053, they estimate that that the whole community will have $0 in wealth. For what it's worth, white folk have about 90%, own 90% of the wealth. No way they could have worked that hard to get that, right? But they own 90% of the wealth. On average, they have anywhere between 140,000 plus in the bank, right? Black Americans have about 1,500 in the bank. I'm in the hood. I'm really in the hood. I'm really on these street corners. I don't even know who has 1,500 in the bank, not in the projects. I don't even know who that, these are economists, right? Thomas Shapiro actually coined the term racial wealth gap. He invited me up to Brandeis. We had a great time, right? I don't even know, right, who has the 1,500, right? Because this is how poor, when we go to LA, they're doing these wonderful studies, right? The average Black American family in LA, not Nigerian Americans, but Black Americans descended of the slave South, $200 in the bank. You go over to Boston, they got $8 in the bank. You go down to Miami, they got $11 in the bank, right? So why am I saying this? It would be naive, not that anyone on this panel is suggesting this, but it would be naive to think about addressing any of these problems, criminalization, schooling inequality, the violence, you name the indicator, without grappling with in serious ways, the poverty, right? To think so, I think, again, would be naive or manipulative. I'm still figuring out sometimes, depending who's in front of me, which one it is. Sometimes it's both. And especially, right, keep this in mind. And again, I'm saying all of this in love. I'm saying all of this in the spirit of justice and liberation, right? Sometimes I got to underscore that. I'm an impassioned person because this stuff is in my blood. This is my family. I am from these communities and this experience. We're researching our lives. right? So with that in mind, right, and from our perspective, theoretical, methodological, and empirical perspectives, right, it is especially necessary to remove in mass, dislocate in mass the men, right, for the viability of the structural order or the status quo. Also, what's most challenging for me is the role, interestingly enough, ironically enough, that the Black middle class and or Black professionals, in particular, Black scholars, are playing in the criminalization of their own people. And there is, and I dare say it, there is always has been, right? There's always been a particular attack on Black American men, descendant of the slave South. Now, I don't say that once again, this is, I think, the third or fourth time. This is not in opposition to the women. We walk in solidarity on this side, right? So from my perspective and the women's perspective that I'm around, right? This is not to divide us. This is to help unite us. There is a particular attack on the men, and for what it's worth, right? I would add, I often say, and sometimes right, and there's a particular attack especially on strong, heterosexual, Black men with a little bit of an edge, right? Those Black men are out. They are removed at this point from intentionally removed from every major industry in the United States, including the academy and even hip hop, entertainment, and sports, right? I'll close by this. So in turn, right, we create narratives and so-called science as a way to kind of justify the criminalization, the marginalization, and or the ruthless treatment of the men, right? The DNC in particular, I think is interesting. I get a lot of my money from politicians. My first big project is actually funded by Barack Obama and Joe Biden, interestingly enough. I'm around these folk all the time, right? No, not Barack Obama, the Bidens, though, you know, in Delaware. Right, we know all of these folk, the governors all the way down to city council, personally, right? The DNC, as I've expressed, I had an interview with the Los Angeles Times last week. The DNC, right, in particular, they want to know about Black masculinity and Trump. I don't even know what they're talking about, right? That's what I expressed. The DNC and pundits, particularly on mainstream media platforms, including the Black ones, right? I think it's so interesting how they work so hard to divide Black women from their men. As one of my doctoral students from Baltimore says, the women that you're seeing on MSNBC and CNN are not representative of us. And I thank her for reminding me of that. We stand with you, right? And they're doing this, presumably, meaning the DNC, right? All in the name of fairness, justice, and liberation. Really, because that's what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Payne, for another another answer that so fully embodies what we're supposed to be talking about in this panel today. Dr. Mohammed, should I repeat the question one more time, or would you like to just continue?
Yeah, thank you so much for laying that foundation, Dr. Johnson and Payne. When I think about the challenges of criminalization, specifically from early childhood to young adulthood in my work, it's a real challenge that this is a population that is being targeted to fill the next prison beds. So when we think about the school to prison pipeline, it is a real thing. Oftentimes individuals use, you know, the coupling of that language through the discipline of sociology or even criminology or even psychology to make it, to take it out of context. And so I think, as I think about the many challenges, one of the major one is that individuals learn terms and different rhetorics in the textbooks that oftentimes erase Blackness out of it and doesn't allow it to be a central concept, but then again, doesn't provide for the realistic playing out of how these kids actually get down that pipeline. One of the major challenges is that the rhetoric is so negative in highlighting this dissecting of the Black family, starting with the Black man, going into the Black woman and motherhood, and therefore, you know, exploding anything connected to having babies and children. So really the, you know, ostracization of the entire population and generation of Black and brown individuals. I think through these disciplines, it is breeding death through language, through discipline, and individuals are paying for it, right? So there's a lot of danger in teaching individuals about these concepts where it becomes words and they can't place reality in it. Therefore, you find that those individuals that are among us are also killing verbally the pride and the upward mobility of young children themselves. Specifically, when we think about children of incarcerated parents, oftentimes the negative rhetoric that is in the field and that individuals talk about that's highlighted in the media finds its way in the home. And so you have caregivers now using that same, you know, white supremacist language to destroy and conquer the self-esteem of these young, resilient individuals, to not only hate their parents, but to hate themselves. And that is a big challenge. When individuals feel like, I'm going to prison because my dad went to prison, but don't understand the phenomenon of white supremacy, patriarchy, and really the history of enslavement, not starting from being enslaved, but starting from kings and queens. And so really, you're talking about a population of young individuals that don't fully understand their potential, and neither do the parents, right? And so oftentimes you find in these households that parents are now using the language of the dead white theorists that disrespects us in the textbook now in their households. And that is an issue, specifically for me, a challenge. I think it can be overcome, but we have to have realistic conversations, is that social capital matters. You know, in the hood, a lot of people like to say talk is cheap. My talk ain't cheap. I don't think anybody that's on this panel, or anybody in the hood for that matter, if you're talking about street research, this is language, this is information that then creates entire substantial studies of individuals. So your words, you know, are powerful. And I think the challenge is that people look at enslavement and they think about all of these different robust, you know, phenomenons, but they're not thinking about the power of just your voice. Just your power of your voice, regardless of if you live in a socially disorganized community, regardless if you attend a school that is socially disorganized, over-policed, underutilized as it relates to having minority teachers, your voice still matters. And what I find is that these children almost are pushed into the realm of mass incarceration without getting an opportunity to fully look in the mirror. In my study, where I interviewed children ages 7 through 18, I interviewed children of incarcerated parents in their bedrooms with the doors closed, right? As an ethnographer, I embed myself in the environment in order to understand it, but I didn't want their grandmothers getting in the way. You know, you telling me something because grandma's there and she's the one that has to buy your Jordans. I don't want anybody in the way of that information, because we all know that money is power, and that's why there's a threat on a theory, on a critical race theory, because of the power behind the analysis that individuals can do when they connect that theory to that narrative. And a lot of those children said to me, I'm so mad at my grandmother. She's lying to me, telling me that my dad is in boot camp and my cousin is in boot camp and he comes home on the weekends. You telling me that this young Black brother was angry and frustrated because he just wanted his truth? If Disney is blasting the truth all over the screens and getting goo gobs of money for it, why are we still lying to our babies? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. Outside of the phenomenon that we've been bamboozled into believing that a fluffy life means lying about the reality of white supremacy in America. It's nothing to lie about. It's nothing to hide about. We know how this system works, and we have to begin to educate the youngest of individuals among us. When I interviewed for Success and Resilience, you know, a lot of times when I go to these panels, people are waiting for me at the end of the panel and they are upset. Why? Because I'm challenging everything that they're saying, in the sense of, I'm going to educate Black children. I created an educational coloring book for children of incarcerated parents. And oftentimes my non-Black and brown brethren question me and say, do you not think that a book like this propels individuals, especially young folk, into the prison? When has it ever been a sin to educate individuals? And why are you paying 6 figures to send your kids to school? But if they're Black or brown, it's a problem for them to be educated. The challenge is that individuals have to understand that education does not only happen in ivory towers, that it happens everywhere, everywhere. And until we begin to give younger individuals, young adults, as well as juveniles and children, their truth, they're going to be disregarded and follow the way of those individuals that we don't want them to go to. What I found was that a lot of children of incarcerated parents and young adults were civic engagers. Oftentimes, because their parents are disenfranchised, we automatically want to put that box on the population. These children were voting, young adults voting in the gubernatorial election, in the presidential election, voting. These individuals were fighting for policies to protect their parents that we claim are not good parents, the parents that they love, the parents that are protecting them in these streets because they're telling them, I don't think you should hang out with X, Y, and Z. Is there a parent there? The parent that's incarcerated and through call, mail, and visits remembers all of their friends so that they don't even have to repeat a story. So they become their bestie from behind bars, but we eradicate them as a means to try to pull that Black father out of that house, pull that Black mother out of that house, and rip them into shreds so that the framework and the blueprint is no longer there. Universities can't take the place of the family. You know, as an instructor, I can't take the place of an incarcerated parent. And that's why I bring the students to the facility so that they can see we have expertise and information, but it's a difference from having a lived experience and only having a read experience. And with a read experience, you too have to decide what piece of that textbook knowledge are you going to take. What I'm really trying to say is that the children that are directly impacted are our answers to the solutions. We know that these young Black children are resilient, they are successful, and not only are they taking care of themselves, let's be honest about the fact that they're taking care of their community too. They're doing work that adults, educated or not, are not doing at all. For example, they've created scholarship programs for children of incarcerated parents that has raised more than $300,000 across the nation. These are individuals that are getting states, entire states, to write into policy that during COVID-19, they are not going to pay for collect calls so that they can maintain contact with their incarcerated loved ones. So when I talk about moving away from a deficit of, you know, looking at the shortcomings of the population, a lot of individuals get upset, you know, because they don't want to see our population as resilient, as successful. And oftentimes policymakers say to me on Capitol Hill, Doc, you know, I understand your research and it's good, but for me, I feel it's unrealistic. And I say, how so? And they say, because, you know, we got here from pulling on the heartstrings of individuals. We got people to care about Black kids that have parents in prison by telling them everything that goes wrong. And I said, would you describe your kids like that? So don't think you're going to describe mine like that. I am not saying that there are not shortcomings. What I am saying is we learn more from resilience than we do from deficits. Why? Because resiliency leads a pathway. And a pathway means we can be proactive. Now, if you want me to do research to stigmatize my population, I am not signing up for it, because all it does is give you a red flag to point in the air when you want to shoot, eradicate, or incarcerate or erase my population. And that is not going to happen on my watch.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad, and also Dr. Johnson and Dr. Payne for such sort of thought-provoking, provocative, important answers. We are running short of time because we've had so much great content on commentary already. And so what we're going to do as our final question is we're going to link everything we've been talking about to the current context, right, to COVID-19 and the pandemic. And in order to save enough time for the Q&A, we're going to ask everyone to do a quick 2-minute sort of speed answer, tying this all together to, and so the way I'm going to phrase the question is, thinking about your own research, in what ways has criminalization changed during the COVID-19 pandemic for the groups you study? And Dr. Johnson, and then Dr. Payne and Dr. Muhammad, if you each want to do just 2 minutes, you can take it in succession and I won't interrupt. Dr. Johnson, would you start?
Well, I mean, I'm struggling with the question, but because I also think that criminalization is a pandemic, anti-Blackness is a pandemic, erasure is a pandemic, and white supremacy is a disease. It's an infection, a social infection that we need to eradicate. So that's why I'm struggling with the question, but I would say within this particular moment, it's clear that criminalization does not stop because there's COVID. COVID then facilitates a different type of criminalization. And that's been, I want to say, the story of the Black experience, that every new social invention comes with some type of utility toward criminalization. And in this case, you know, I'm thinking about the young child that had the toy gun at home while he's on Zoom. And then the teacher decides that she should report it, and then the principal calls the calls the police, and the police arrive at the home, and at no time did anyone contact the parent that was also home. So even in contexts where, you know, there are two parents there and they are supervising their kids' educational experience, somehow the school system manages to still circumvent all of these different levels of protection and place those kids really at risk. So, you know, I'll stop there because I know you only said 2 minutes, but the point here is that I don't think COVID has stopped criminalization, and I think that people are using COVID as a moment to criminalize.
Yeah, I'm jumping there real quick. I know I only got 2 minutes. I'm gonna work really hard to do this. So I agree with Dr. Johnson. It's, I guess, the assumption of the question so I get where you're going with it. So, you know, but nonetheless, right, these problems were already here. There never was a time in Black American history where we did not experience just what we're experiencing: crime, bad schools, joblessness, etc. Look at the work of Robin Kelly, urban historian, very famous urban historian. He makes this argument too, particularly with his mythic past argument. We are a bottom caste. That's my central message, right? Structural violence, right? Systems and institutions work really hard to prevent individuals, groups, and communities from meeting their basic needs in service of middle America. Cannot have one without the other. No way to address any of these problems without addressing the economic system that requires a bottom caste, right? The reason why they don't do anything is because if you remove the bottom caste, we're in Great Depression times 13. So as opposed to that, they will look the other way. That's critical race theory. That's Derek Bell. That's not me, right? With that in mind, I think COVID-19 plus the policing pandemic, right, and or violence that we're having, the intersection of that, as we're writing about now, I think, you know, the way to maybe think about it is it just will ratchet up or more deeply concentrate the problems that were already there, right? And that's in terms of my work. Definitely issues around policing and definitely interpersonal violence, right? Shootings and the homicides, right? All of that will ratchet up, given and will undermine the little bit of available resources that are there, right? So these communities are struggling to begin with. But given the COVID-19 environment, and I'm interestingly, right, I think, you know, a post-COVID-19 environment, to be honest with you, is going to render our communities in a more unstable state, which suggests to me that things will be even worse, you know, in the few years that will come.
For me, I would say that, you know, COVID has caused havoc as it relates to mass incarceration specifically. You know, there are children that I have to work with whose parents died to COVID, lost their lives inside of the facility. They don't have access to speak. There's no closure. There's no way to explain that to the child, on top of the fact that some of the families haven't even told the children the honest truth about where the parent is. So could you imagine having to find out for the first time that you no longer have your father, you no longer have your mother, and you lost them to this life kind of in prison? So COVID-19 has closed off almost all access to facilities. That means no college classrooms are going in. When we are providing curriculums, that means that they're recorded and the recordings are going in. What does that mean? It means there's no eyes, right? It takes the eyes out of the system. And where does COVID put the eyes? In your house. So just when you thought that you were protected, just when you thought that you had a little bit, you had a little bit of safety where you could close the door and keep it real with those individuals that you love in your family, no longer, because now the eyes of teachers are in, the social workers' eyes are in your house, your professors' eyes are in your house. And guess what? These are institutions by law. We have to report any instances that we see as well. Any IRB institution, any study that you're doing, when you see these negative things, the reason why oftentimes people stay out of those realms when they do their research is because of this identification that you have to do in order to write them up. So COVID required for the households to be looked into. And I think strategically, it requires surveillance. So now you have instructors that want access to lectures. Now, instead of lecturing to the individual, you're lecturing to the whole household. The individual that doesn't have a space where they can show their face, and some of the schools are saying, oh no, you have to show your face, because depending on your social economic status depends on how nice your background is gonna look. All of my students may not have access to that. They may be calling in on a phone or in a car. Right now, I'm teaching college and high school classes. So not only do I teach college in prison, I'm also teaching college in the hood, to 11th and 12th graders, first generation, Title I high school, similar to the ones that I attended, so that they could have 3 credits to a Howard University. COVID-19 means less access for them. So now they're ashamed to have to call in and not want to show their face. And I tell them it's all good. So you're also talking about things moving fairly quickly. So that means even instructors don't have the blueprint for how to move forward. And students are being, reprimanded for not showing their face, not engaging in a dialogue, not opening up their life to the video world. Everything is recorded now. So when you talk about criminalization, that's the criminalization of your lecture too. That also means, you have freedom of speech, when and where? Academic freedom, who? Because those lectures get out to the wrong person, and now it's an issue. It's surveillance. It really is white supremacy at its best. And oftentimes, the place where you thought that you were the safest is no longer that instance. And so we have yet to understand really the depth of the reality of this COVID-19 thing. But that's just a little bit of what I've seen so far.
Dr. Muhammad, thanks so much. Dr. Payne, Dr. Johnson. We're going to have one more quick loop through everyone with a question, building on what Dr. Muhammad was saying, linking everything back to the question of policy prescriptions. So the final question, and again, we're going to try to keep it to short. If it goes over 2 minutes, okay, but in that range so that we have some time for Q&A. And our final question is, given that it's an election year, almost an election month, and with the transition to online learning, which has had unequal impacts within communities of color, what policies on a local and national level would you suggest being considered related to addressing ongoing criminalization in schools and racial justice more generally? So again, we'll start with Dr. Johnson and then Dr. Payne and Dr. Muhammad.
If I understand the question correctly, so you're saying that I'm sorry, could Dr. Brown,
should I repeat?
help me a little bit with the question?
Why don't I repeat? So the framing is just, given that it's an election year and there's been this transition to online learning, which has had unequal impacts within communities of color, the question we're asking, so that's context. The question we're asking is, what policies on a local and a national level would you suggest to be considered specifically related to the ongoing criminalization in schools and racial justice more generally?
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yes,
Great.
definitely. Well, the first thing I would say in schools in particular is get rid of zero tolerance. That's one of the first things. We're also needing really a more diverse teaching workforce. And unfortunately, when we have this situation where there are cultural incongruities, there are different perspectives and worldviews, oftentimes the student's perspective is what's sacrificed, because we all know that schools are sites of authority. They are actually agents of the state, and teachers in that way often are also white American. And so, you know, I don't know exactly how we change the teaching workforce. I mean, there are all sorts of proposals out there, but we never seem to get below that 70% um, um, rate of representation for white teachers within public school settings. And so that, I think, is one of the things that has been debilitating over time. It's not just a recent phenomenon. It's the same thing that has animated disproportionate SPED rates, special education rates, disproportionalities in discipline, of course, suspension, expulsion, and other ways in which we criminalize girls of color in particular, which through dress code policies. So there are a number of things that we should be thinking about, and really just too many um, to change. I mean, not to change, but to enumerate, because there are so many problems there. I could also throw in, let's get rid of the SROs, you know, and because we know that schools with SROs have over 12% higher referral rate than those that do not have it. So there's just a number of ways that we can move forward. Let's have trauma-informed practices. Let's do restorative justice and restorative practices. But yes, it would take a whole scale makeover of schools. So if you want to say, you know, defund the police, defund schools and start over, because that's the type of approach that we're going to need in order to get schools to where they function best for people of color.
Oh, from my perspective, given how severe and how intergenerational the problems are, right? Given how intentional and insidious and nefarious all of this is, given that we are a bottom caste and nobody's losing any sleep. And I often say, if you can go to sleep comfortably at night, I promise you, you are the problem. Whoever you are too, that's including Black people, right? Given how severe the problem is, right? And also given, you know, what we're learning through this racial wealth gap data and or some of the arguments that these leading economists are making, they say this as well, the mainstream ones, I might add. The only thing that could possibly address the criminalization of Black folk, brown folk, other folk, right? The only thing that could really respond to this in any realistic way, right? We could do a program here, a policy there, right? At the end of the day, 9 times out of 10, it never will fix the problem. We are largely a wealthless people. That is the problem. See, wealth will get the police off your back, right? Wealth will get bad schools out of your neighborhoods. Other than that, you're just negotiating with your oppressor, and we see how far that's gotten us. Given what leading mainstream economists are suggesting, I mean, I didn't need them to say it, but given, let me just use them because sometimes that could make folk feel a little more comfortable, right? I listen to folk on the ground, particularly men and women in those streets. The least, right, or the most vulnerable of us, right, are my teachers and instructors. My politics are in alignment with the poorest sections of our community, first and foremost. Given how extreme, how severe the problem is, for me and many others, there's nothing that makes the most sense as a policy prescription than a robust Black reparations package. That would solve all of these problems, right? And maybe a year or two, people laughed at that. That's pretty surprising within the last year how much support that's been acquired, not only in the Black community, but in the white community. Black folk are still laughing at that one too. Given these homes that I'm in, the rats, the roaches, and everything else that I see, given that everybody's going to sleep comfortable, from my perspective, the best policy that we can put in place, and millions of Black folk are presently fighting for on the ground, rabidly fighting for too, is a robust Black reparations package.
That definitely want to uplift Dr. Payne, Dr. Johnson, and what they've said. Some of the smaller policy implications that I envision would be requiring licensures of law enforcement officers. You have to have a license to, do any sort of surgery. You do it wrong, they take it away. I think those sort of concepts are needed too in law enforcement. I was on a panel with Roz Baraka for Howard Homecoming, and that was a topic that he brought up and we kind of talked about. And I want to begin to explore that more as it relates to law enforcement. I do agree with school resource officers, removing them from the school, not over policing, requiring every school, middle school, elementary school, to have African-American studies, in the sense of really not necessarily separate from American history, but connected in. Oftentimes individuals going into HBCUs is the first time that they're hearing about their history, and that needs to start a lot earlier. I also think providing support and resources into HBCUs, not just one or two, but all of them, and uplifting the scholars that are doing work in the streets, that are doing work with NSF, that's doing work because like Dr. Goff mentioned, one of the panels that I was on, data doesn't talk, we do. So really getting back to having analysis of individuals, of data and of information in that way. And then also taking off the embargoes on data, right? We know that we have policing data that's embargoed, that individuals have no access to look at, no access to engage with. I think we need to begin to look at that. And then also putting some of these training modules inside of HBCUs under the leadership of Black and Brown scholars. For example, shooting scenarios. We have a robust Department of Engineering that can create shooting scenarios where everybody on the other end is not Latinx or Black or Indigenous or trans, but really creating these sort of mechanisms where we are using our innovation and creativity. We have gotten away from the ability to do that because of our labor and us being a part of this underclass and in this particular system, leaving us as kind of these workers. But we are the innovators and we are the creative individuals. And I would like to see us get back to policy that is indicative of that. Again, smaller policy implications, and I just want to uplift what was already said from Dr. Payne and Johnson.
Dr. Johnson, Dr. Payne, Dr. Mohammed, thank you so much for your answers to the questions today. This has been a great panel. I was about to say we're going to open it up to Q&A, but so let's do that. We're going to open it up to Q&A for anyone who is in attendance. There's the Q&A window. I believe it should be all the way at the right on the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to submit questions via the Q&A. I believe Dr. Dow, I have a question that I'm going to ask you. Is that Dr. Dow's question? In any case, I have one question for you from the Q&A. And we're going to put a 1 minute limit on it since we're already at the end, but we wanted to get this one in. The question is going to be, so in about 30 seconds, what is one thing we can do as individuals to support challenges to structures that criminalize Black and Brown communities? And Dr. Johnson, Dr. Payne, Dr. Mohammed, in that order again, please.
One thing.
Dr. Johnson, I believe you're muted.
I'm sorry about that. One institution is coming up next week, and it's, voting. And one thing that we've got to make sure we embrace, and that is the fact that we can't wait on anyone other than our brothers and sisters to make the change that we need. So make sure you take the initiative, commit yourself to doing something next week and engaging civically to make sure the policies that are effective are the ones that we see put in place and that we can advocate for whoever decides to, or whoever ends up being in the office.
Yeah, I would say start where you are, meaning, like they say, politics is local, but most organizing initiatives are local. Bell Hooks writes a powerful essay, which I'm blanking on the title of, but she says it's time for us to return to the small time or small table, there we go, small table conversations. Right, she says we've lost that, from the 60s and from civil rights and Black Power movement in exchange for this kind of justice diva-ness, right? Her language, right? We become these intellectual divas, right? And as opposed to rolling up our sleeves, having some small table conversations, right? And really getting out there and doing the unglorious, oftentimes unrewarded work that is necessary for the change that we want to see. Go to where you're at, organize with whom you got, right? I agree with Dr. Johnson. We are all, in terms of who we have to make the change that we all want, right? I'll leave you with this quote, which is comes to me from the streets of Black America, if you will. Also sometimes, parodied by a number of those gangster rappers. But they say, if you want to understand us and help us create the change that we are all looking for, then walk with me, right? There's no way to understand culture or communities like these, from a laptop, from a documentary, from YouTube, from a book, or from a class. I think all of it has its limits. I think it has its value, absolutely. But at the end of the day, right, William Julius Wilson says, as the Academy, we do culture very poorly. We don't really know how to study it. Why? Well, because the only way that you can understand culture and or the lived experience, particularly of those who are struggling most, is by immersing yourself in the experience for a sustained period of time. And most of us, including the Black scholars, who are just as afraid oftentimes as the white scholars, most of us are unwilling to do that. But the street says, if you want change, walk with me.
And I would just add to that very quickly, just to state, don't be the criminalizer. Don't be the white supremacist. Don't be that individual that looks down upon individuals because they're connected to somebody that's incarcerated, because they are substance abusing, because they're getting high on the weekend, because they're in your family and they stay locked in a room, because they don't have a job. In fact, talk with them, engage in conversations with those individuals in your family and see what it is you can learn. I would say, start with yourself. So many people start on the outside. You have to start with yourself and identify your own insecurities, regardless of what it is that you do or how individuals may put you on a platform. But really not believe in the hype. Don't believe the hype. It's not what the media is saying. It's not what the presidential candidates are saying, on that block. It really is, your truth. And so I say, be in it, but not of it. Be in it, but not of it.
Dr. Johnson, Dr. Payne, Dr. Mohammed, one of the questions in the Q&A is simply, quote, not a question, but a deep expression of gratitude for this talk. So that is coming from the attendees and from myself and from the organizers. This has been great. Thanks so much for everything you've shared today. I will turn this over to Chandra, Chandra Reina has been one of the student organizers, and she will close us out.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Brannigan, for moderating a great panel. And thank you, Dr. Payne, Johnson, and Mohammed for accepting our invitation and for leaving us with powerful remarks and reflections on this topic. I also want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us today. And then, of course, all of our co-sponsors around the university for helping us bring this event together.